The snow had stopped falling by midnight, but the cold had settled deep like it meant to stay. Wind dragged itself over the plains, slow and deliberate, pressing against the sagging frame of the house until every board groaned in protest. Inside, the fire had burned low. Only coals pulsed behind the grate, casting faint light across the room like the last heartbeat of something dying. Margaret sat motionless at the kitchen table, her back straight though her body begged to fold. The children slept behind the curtains strung across the far corner of the room, their breath faint and uneven under thin quilts. The baby had whimpered earlier, but now even she was quiet. Margaret's hands lay palm down on the scarred wood of the table. One was still streaked with flour from earlier, the other clenched slightly as if remembering the grip of the axe handle. It was silent in that room, and yet not. The silence was thick with things unsaid, with what she should have told him before he rode out that morning, with the space he left behind. He had not come home. She'd told herself all afternoon he was delayed, that the storm had slowed him, that the horse had thrown a shoe, that he was waiting it out at Whitlow's place. But the truth had slipped in as dusk fell, quiet as frost on glass. He was gone. Whether by choice or by chance, she did not know. The not knowing was the worst part. Outside, the plains stretched in every direction, blanketed in white, rimmed with shadow. No neighbors close enough to call. No road visible. No moon. The door rattled in its frame. She flinched. Her eyes shifted to the rifle propped against the wall. He had left it carelessly or deliberately. Either way, it was hers now. The wood of the floor was cold beneath her bare feet when she finally stood. The kettle still held warm water from earlier, and she poured some into a chipped basin, scrubbing her hands clean with slow, deliberate movements. She did not look in the mirror above the washstand. She knew what she would see: 33 years worn to 50, with skin pulled tight across sharp bones and eyes that seemed too wide and a face gone hollow. She walked to the window and pushed the curtain aside. The dark was complete. No flicker of lanterns. No hoofprints in the snow. Only the long breath of the land, endless and uncaring. Her throat tightened. She pressed her forehead to the glass. She could not cry. There wasn't time. There wasn't space for it. Not with the children needing food come morning and the animals unwatered in the barn. She would have to hitch the old mare herself, drive to town, or send word somehow. But not now. Not yet. Now she just needed to survive the night. She moved back to the table and sat, pulled the ledger toward her, though the numbers danced like ghosts on the page. 3 sacks of flour left. Less than a week of coffee. Almost no sugar. The oats might stretch if she watered the milk enough. She drew a line under the last entry and stopped, her pencil hovering above the paper. She remembered the sound of his boots on the porch, how they used to come steady, solid, announcing him. How she used to hate that sound when she was younger, when her pride still stung from the way he looked past her, like she was just another piece of the land he'd married. But years had softened things, made them quieter. Not gentler exactly, but realer. The fire hissed as a log shifted. She looked up, startled, expecting him. But there was no one. Margaret stood again, walked to the hearth, fed the fire a single log, enough to keep it going, but not too much. They couldn't spare more. She knelt there a long while, the heat licking at her skirt, hands folded in her lap. When the knock came, it was soft. So soft she thought she'd imagined it. She rose slowly, eyes narrowing toward the door. It came again, 3 measured taps. Her fingers curled around the rifle before her feet moved. Every step was slow. She unlatched the door and opened it. Wind rushed in, bitter and alive. A figure stood against the dark snow, clinging to the brim of his hat and the folds of his coat. He didn't speak, didn't move, but his chest rose and fell hard, like he'd been riding a long way. Her voice broke the silence. "You're not him." "No," the man said. She tightened her grip on the rifle. "Who are you?" He pulled off his hat slowly, his hands steady despite the cold. "My name's Elijah. He told me to come if he didn't." Something in her chest snapped, not loud, not bright, just a thread coming loose after being pulled too tight too long. She stepped back just enough to let the light fall on his face. "You knew him?" He nodded. "We worked cattle together in the hills." Her hand dropped. Not the rifle, just her hand. And for the first time that night, Margaret's knees nearly gave out. She did not ask him in. Not right away. The storm might have softened, but the air still cut like a blade. And yet Elijah stood there, his breath ghosting around him, not pushing, not pleading, just waiting. Margaret's eyes flicked to the barn, then back to the stranger. The wind had started up again. A long, steady moan across the land like something mourning far off. "The children are asleep," she said at last. "Don't wake them." He dipped his head. "I won't." She stepped aside and he entered without a word. The door groaned shut behind him, and the warmth of the house, thin as it was pressed against the cold on his coat. Snow melted fast on the floorboards where he stood, but he didn't shrug it off. He just stood near the stove, not too close, as if he understood this wasn't his place. Margaret watched him a moment longer, then moved past. She poured what was left in the kettle into a tin cup and held it out to him. He took it carefully, like he expected the handle to bite. "Thank you." She nodded once. He drank slowly, the steam rising between them, filling the space with something almost like peace. But not quite. "You said he told you to come," she said. Elijah looked down into the cup. 2 weeks ago. He said if anything happened, if he didn't make it back, someone had to tell you. And make sure you had help. Her hands stiffened. "What happened?" "He got turned around out west. Snow came in faster than they thought. He stayed behind to keep the others moving." "Did they make it?" Elijah nodded. 3 of them did. "And him?" He looked up then. His eyes weren't sharp or sorrowful. They were quiet, tired. "I buried him yesterday." She did not cry. Her jaw tightened, but no sound came. Only a slow nod. Once. Then again. Behind the curtain, one of the children stirred. A soft cough, then silence. Margaret moved to the stove, pulled another cup down. "There's not much, but I'll heat more water." "You don't have to." "I know." He stood there, hat in his hands, waiting while she worked. She moved like she'd moved every day for years, without waste, without noise. A worn rhythm. She poured the rest of the oats into a small pot, added water, stirred. He watched her the way a man watches someone building a fire from a single match. Careful, not interrupting. When the food was ready, she gave him half. They sat at the table, neither speaking. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, the wind scraped across the roof again. A plank shifted. "I was going to send a letter," Elijah said, his voice low. "But he made me promise." She nodded. He always thought letters were cowardly. He almost smiled. "Almost." "He ever talk about me?" she asked. Elijah paused, then nodded. "Said you were tougher than most men he'd met. Said you once stitched up a horse's flank with a fishhook and no light." "That's true." "He said you'd probably outlive him." At that, something in her chest shifted. Not grief, not yet, but something like gravel turning underfoot. "I didn't expect him back," she said, "but I thought I'd have more time." They sat in silence again. Then Elijah said, "He left a saddlebag with me. Said it was yours if this happened." Her gaze lifted. "Where is it?" "Still on my horse." "I'll fetch it." She stood. "No, I'll come." He hesitated, then followed her out into the cold. The snow crunched beneath their boots. The stars were out now, brittle and distant, hanging low over the plain. The barn loomed in the dark, the door half ajar. Inside the maar nickered soft, startled by the wind. Elijah led his gelding toward the fence, unstrapped a worn leather bag. Margaret reached for it. It was heavier than she expected. She didn't open it. Not there. Not yet. You staying anywhere, she asked. No. You got work. Not steady. She looked at the barn, then at the house, then at the man who had brought her the worst news a person could carry and carried it all the way across winter. You're not sleeping out in this, she said. I can make do. No. We've got room. He hesitated. I said we've got room. You'll sleep in the loft. You earn your keep? His eyes met hers. Yes, ma'am. They walked back together, wind at their backs now. She didn't speak. He didn't push, and the snow no longer felt quite so sharp against her face. Subscribe and keep the long ride alive. In the loft the straw was dry and thick enough to hold the cold at bay. Elijah laid his coat beneath him, rolled the saddle blanket tight for a pillow. The house below was quiet again. The kind of quiet that wasn't peace, just the breath held between two long hours. He hadn't lied to her. Not about the death. Not about the promise. But there were things he hadn't said and likely never would. Things like the way her husband had spoken her name before riding back into the storm, or how he'd refused the extra coat, just so Elijah could carry the saddlebag dry. She didn't need those stories. She already knew the man she'd married. By morning the cold had crept in through every crack and board. Margaret was up before the light boiling water, slicing hard bread into thinner pieces. Her fingers ached, but she didn't let it slow her. She didn't wake the children, not yet. They needed what sleep they could get before the day demanded something of them. She heard him descend the ladder just as she set the coffee to steep. There's water, she said, not turning. He found the basin, scrubbed his face clean without a word. When he was done, she handed him a cup. You any good with animals? She asked. Yes. Chickens are easy. Cows stubborn. Mare's worse. He took the coffee, nodded. I'll start with the cow. She watched him walk out into the pale gray light, and something in her chest lifted just a little. Not hope. Not yet. But motion. The days stacked one on another like fence rails. Elijah stayed. Not because she asked, but because neither of them spoke of him leaving. He fixed the back door, shoveled snow from the roof, repaired a bent hinge on the chicken coop without being told. She cooked, cleaned, taught the children letters on scrap paper. They worked in parallel, never idle, rarely speaking unless needed. But there was no frost between them. Just the quiet of two people with more tasks than time. It was 2 weeks before she opened the saddlebag. The children were asleep, the fire low. Elijah had gone to the barn to check on the cow, though she knew it didn't need checking. He gave her that space without asking. Inside the bag were clothes, his spare shirt, a pair of wool socks, the old knife she'd once given him on their anniversary, the blade worn but sharp, and letters, wrapped in twine, her name written on each in his blocky scrawl. She didn't read them all at once. She couldn't. She read one, then held the rest close to her chest, eyes shut, as if they could warm her more than the fire. In the letter he said he'd known, that he wasn't strong like her, not in the ways that counted, that he'd married her too young, been too proud to say when he was afraid, too slow to see how much she carried alone. But he saw it now. He hoped she'd forgive him, but didn't expect it. He ended with, I've never known how to say things right. But you were the best thing that ever happened to me. Tell the children I went out trying to get home. Not away from them. Home. She folded it slow, put it back in the bag. Then she laid her head on the table and let her shoulders shake. No sobs. Just the silent trembling of a woman, finally letting the weight shift even if just an inch. When Elijah came in, he paused in the doorway. She didn't look up and he didn't move toward her. After a moment, he spoke. I was thinking I'd try to fix the sled runners tomorrow. If we're going to haul firewood, they'll need mending. She wiped her face on her sleeve, sat up. All right, she said. He nodded and stepped inside, took off his coat, sat across from her. Neither spoke again that night. But something had settled. Not comfort, not yet, but the kind of silence that waits patiently for words to grow. Spring came slow that year. The snow didn't melt so much as retreat, reluctant, bitter, giving way inch by inch until patches of dead grass showed like old scars. The sky stayed low and colorless, but the wind softened and the days lengthened enough to hint at something beyond survival. Margaret spent most mornings in the garden plot, turning soil with bare hands when the frost allowed. The children helped in bursts, digging shallow lines for seed that had waited all winter in a tin jar. She'd rationed the stores tight enough to save some, maybe just enough. Elijah split wood without being asked. He'd already rebuilt the gate to the chicken yard and patched the barn roof with spare shingles. Each day he did something quiet and useful, never asking what came next. They rarely spoke of her husband, but his presence lingered, not heavy, just constant, a memory that lived in the way Margaret folded blankets, or how Elijah never touched the coffee pot without checking if she'd had her share. There was a rhythm between them now, born not of closeness, but of shared weight. One afternoon, Margaret caught him staring out at the horizon. He was sitting on the porch, sharpening his knife, but his hands had stilled. You ever think about going back? She asked from the doorway. He didn't turn. To what? Wherever you were before. He shook his head. There's nothing for me back that way. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. The sun had finally shown itself just enough to throw long shadows. You got people. Had. He paused. My mother died some years ago. I don't know where my brother ended up. Margaret nodded slowly. That why you never settled? Part of it. Never had reason to stay anywhere. She studied him for a long moment. You do now. Elijah looked at her then. Not surprised, not hopeful. Just quiet. I know, he said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even gratitude, but it was enough. That night after supper he brought out a carved piece of wood from his bag. A figure roughly hewn but careful. A bird, wings half lifted, caught in the moment before flight. Something I've been working on, he said, setting it on the table. Thought maybe the boy would like it. Margaret reached out, ran her fingers over the wings. The grain was soft from sanding, the shape delicate. He will. I used to carve, he said, back when things were slower. Why'd you stop? Didn't have anyone to make things for. She didn't answer, just left her hand on the bird a moment longer, then rose to check on the baby. He watched her go, then looked back at the carving. He'd started it weeks ago, not knowing why. Now he understood. The next morning they hitched the mare to the wagon for a trip to town. Supplies were low again, and it was time to show their faces. Margaret dressed plain but neat, her hair pinned, shoulders squared. Elijah wore a clean shirt. The boy rode up front, holding the reins with Elijah's hand guiding his. In town the stairs came slow and steady. Whispers behind hands, long looks from the mercantile clerk, but no one said anything outright. Margaret stood straighter, chin high. She paid in coin, no credit, and looked every man in the eye. Elijah carried the sacks, nodded to folks, but didn't push conversation. He knew what they saw, a widow and a stranger. A man not her husband. A family reshaping itself in plain sight. On the way home, the wind turned warmer. You'll get talk for this, he said, not looking at her. I already have, she said. Doesn't matter. You sure? Yes. Her voice was steady. I'm not hiding from anybody. He looked at her then. Really, look. You don't have to explain anything to me, he said. I know. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it wasn't empty. It was solid. That night she watched him light the lantern, watched how he moved around the room without needing to ask where things belonged. He wasn't a guest anymore. He hadn't been for some time. She thought about her husband, thought about the pain, the years of silence between them, and the unexpected warmth in his final letter. She would carry that with her always. But the living needed more than memory. She reached for Elijah's hand as he passed by, her fingers brushing his. He paused, looked down, and without a word laced his fingers through hers. The summer settled in, dry and steady, with skies that stretched forever and nights that whispered with crickets and old ghosts. The land around the homestead cracked in places, but the garden held. Carrots grew crooked but strong. Beans climbed the twine poles Elijah had lashed together. The children tanned dark from the sun, their legs dusted with dirt, their laughter something light in the air again. Margaret spent less time watching the horizon. She found her hands full most days hauling water, patching clothes, keeping the chickens from wandering too far. There was comfort in the repetition. Not peace, not entirely, but a kind of rhythm that let her breathe. Elijah built a small pen for a second cow, saying nothing of the cost or the work it would take to fill it. Just left it half finished, as if to say, there will be more. He'd taken to teaching the boy how to drive a team, how to sharpen a blade, how to read the weather from the shape of clouds. The girl followed Margaret close, watching, helping, mimicking the small motions of mending and mixing. Some evenings they all sat out front just watching the light fade from the land. You ever think you'd have this? Elijah asked one night, the baby asleep against Margaret's shoulder. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers moved slow across the baby's back, feeling each small breath. No, she said. I thought it was over. He nodded. Me too. The baby stirred, then quieted. A breeze moved through the grass, soft and warm. Do you miss drifting? She asked. He looked at her, surprised. I did, he said. For a long time I thought I wasn't meant for anything steady. I used to think if I stayed too long anywhere something would break. And now. He looked out at the darkening plain. At the fence line he'd mended. At the barn he'd helped repair the window he'd fixed with salvaged glass. Now I think things already broke, but they can be built again. She didn't smile, but her hand reached across the space between their chairs. He took it. Days kept passing. The talk in town quieted, or people got tired of saying the same things. Margaret walked into the mercantile now with her head high and no sense of being out of place. Elijah came with her, sometimes not, but no one whispered any more. The preachers stopped by once, asking if they needed anything. He looked at Elijah long but said nothing beyond kindness. When he left, he shook Elijah's hand. By harvest, Margaret had taken to calling him we. Not he, not Elijah, but we. We'll need more seed next spring. We should think about adding a stove in the barn. He never pointed it out, just nodded, carried on. But each time it settled into his bones like warmth. One morning, as they loaded a wagon with squash and beans for trade, Elijah paused. The boy had gone ahead, the girl chasing after with a basket in her arms. I've been thinking, he said. Margaret looked over. About. He rubbed the back of his neck. About staying. For good. She raised an eyebrow. I thought you already had. He gave a sheepish shrug. I mean, official. She squinted against the sun. You asking me to marry you, Elijah? His mouth twitched. I guess I am. She didn't laugh. Just looked at him long and quiet, the way she always had, like she was weighing something deep, not just in him but in herself. Then she said, "You sure you want a woman with 3 children, a beat-up wagon, and half a roof still leaking when it rained?" He stepped closer. "I've been here long enough to know what I'm asking." She took a breath, let it out slow. "All right then, but I'm not wearing white, and I'm not standing in front of a crowd." He smiled. Wasn't planning on either. They married at the house. Just the preacher, the children, and a handful of neighbors who'd come around again once the gossip ran dry. The girl picked wildflowers for the table. The boy helped Elijah shave. Margaret wore a clean dress, and her hair braided tight. She didn't cry. Neither did he. But when the vows were said and the sun began to set behind them, she reached for his hand, the same way she had that first time, steady, quiet, certain. Later that night, when the children had gone to bed and the house had stilled, Elijah found her out on the porch. "You think we'll be all right?" he asked. Margaret looked out across the land. "Dry. Rough. Still recovering." "We already are," she said. She touched her stomach, then, absently, instinctively, and though no words passed between them, Elijah understood. A beginning. A continuation. Not something new, exactly, but something strong. The first frost came early. Not hard enough to kill, but sharp enough to warn. Margaret pulled the last of the squash and beans from the garden with numb fingers, dirt freezing beneath her nails. Elijah covered the windows with oilcloth, patched the stovepipe, stacked the firewood higher. By then, the baby growing inside her had made itself known. Not to the children yet, they were still too young to carry that kind of anticipation, but to her in the quiet hours before dawn. Her body moved slower now, hips aching by nightfall, but she bore it like all the rest. Without complaint, without fear. Elijah saw it, though, in the way he took the heavier buckets from her hands before she asked, the way he cooked more often, even if he wasn't good at it, the way he rose in the night when the youngest cried, lifting her from sleep with a gentleness that still surprised Margaret. "You don't have to do all that," she said once, watching him kneel by the stove in the early dark. He didn't look up. "I know, but I want to," and that made all the difference. They told the children in late October, after the first snow had dusted the prairie and melted by morning. The boy blinked in confusion. The girl squealed and clapped. The baby only laughed because the others did. That night, after the children had been tucked into quilts, Margaret sat at the edge of the bed, rubbing her knees. "I don't know if I can do it again," she said softly. Elijah didn't speak for a long time. Then he sat beside her. "I'll be here this time," he said. "You won't be alone." And that, too, made all the difference. Winter came hard, as it always did. Snow drifted against the barn door, and the wind rattled the windows like it meant to break them. But the house held. The stove stayed hot. The animals survived. They passed the long nights with books, with stories, with Margaret's knitting and Elijah's carving. He'd made each child a figure now, a horse, a rabbit, a bear. Small things, but solid, like proof. Some nights she found him staring into the fire, lips moving slightly as if repeating something to himself. "What is it?" she asked once. He looked at her. "Just remembering who I used to be. And I don't miss him." Outside the wind howled, but inside the baby kicked against her ribs, and Elijah's hand found hers under the quilt. Spring came slower that year, but with it came green shoots, soft rains, and a new cry in the house. A girl born just after midnight with lungs strong and hair dark like her father's. Margaret held her close, heart-pounding, tears soaking her collarbone. Not from pain, not from fear, just from the sheer blinding weight of being full. Elijah stood by the doorway, hat in hand, eyes wide. He had never seen life begin like that. Not that way. She looked up at him. "Come here," she whispered. He crossed the room in 2 steps, bent low. She placed the tiny girl into his arms. "Her name?" he asked, voice cracking. "Hope," Margaret said. He nodded, tears slipping down without shame. "Hope," he repeated. In the months that followed, the house never felt empty again. There was always someone crying or singing or asking a question. Always something cooking or being fixed or built. Elijah added a room to the back of the house slowly with careful hands and borrowed lumber. The children helped where they could. Margaret planted again, this time with the baby swaddled close to her chest. By summer there was talk in town of building a new school. Margaret was asked to help teach. Elijah started shoeing horses for neighbors. People nodded when they passed, stopped to chat. No one whispered anymore. One evening, Margaret stood at the edge of the porch, watching the sun slide low across the wheat-colored field. The wind brushed her face. Behind her, the children played. Elijah laughed. The baby cooed. She touched the ring on her finger. It wasn't new. It had belonged to his mother. Worn smooth. Nothing fancy. But it fit. And for the first time in a long time, so did she. The years did not pause. They rolled forward steady as the river south of town, carving a deeper groove into everything they touched. But in that house, on that patch of land that once felt too wide and too empty, the days took on a shape. Not ease, life never gave ease, but steadiness. Purpose. A kind of quiet redemption. Hope grew with wild curls and a loud laugh, stubborn like her mother, bold like her father. She followed Elijah everywhere, mud on her boots and questions in her mouth. By the time she was 4, she knew how to hold a hammer, feed chickens, and get her older brother to do her bidding with nothing more than a look. Margaret watched her children move through the world with their own rhythm, now no longer shadowed by fear or silence. The boy had grown tall with a calm to him that reminded her of his father, though his jaw set the same way Elijah's did when he was thinking through a problem. The girl had taken to reading, devouring the few books they had, and asking for more each time a neighbor passed through town. Sometimes Margaret woke early before the sun and sat by the window with her shawl wrapped tight, listening to the soft rise and fall of her family's breathing. The stillness no longer frightened her. It felt like a gift. The land, too, had begun to answer them. The soil turned easier now, less bitter, more forgiving. Trees they planted had taken root. The barn no longer leaned. The fences held. Elijah kept working, never idle, but there was less urgency in his movements. He'd learned how to rest in his own way, learned how to sit still with his hands quiet and his heart full. They didn't speak often about the past, not out of denial but out of understanding. Some things live better in silence, in shared glances, and the small way her hand would find his when the sky turned gray. One afternoon a rider came up the road. Dust on his coat, a long scar across his cheek. Margaret saw him from the porch, set down the mending, and stood. Elijah came out behind her, wiping his hands on a rag. The man didn't dismount right away. Just nodded. "Elijah, Ben." They stared at each other a long moment. "You staying?" Elijah asked. The man looked past him at the children in the yard, the clothesline, the smoke from the chimney. "No," he said. "Just passing through. Thought I'd see for myself." Elijah nodded once. "You did?" The man's eyes flicked to Margaret, then back to Elijah. "You did good." Then he turned his horse and rode on without another word. That night Elijah stood by the door longer than usual, his eyes on the horizon. Margaret said nothing. She knew he wasn't mourning. He was measuring. Later, when the children were asleep, she found him in the kitchen, the lamp low, carving a piece of pine. The shape was still rough, but she could see the outline, a cradle. "You think we'll need another one?" she asked softly. He looked up at her, surprised, then smiled. Slow and true. "Maybe not," he said, "but someone will." She stepped closer, brushing a hand along his arm. "You ever think we'd end up here?" "Not once," he said. Not even in the best kind of dream. She leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, and they stood there a long time. The cradle between them, unfinished, full of possibility. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like a hymn. Not sorrowful, not sweet, just real. And in that small house, on that once lonely stretch of prairie, everything that mattered was already there. Subscribe and don't let the trail go cold.